Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 6th day of October, I believe. I'm heading toward an anniversary of sorts. The end of this week on the 11th, which is a Saturday, of course, will be that'll be the anniversary of the start of our program in March of last year, the March of 2013. So that'll be 19 months that we've been together here at the Virtual Center. It's hard to believe. It's gone by so quickly. Everybody always told me that as you get older, time goes by faster and faster and faster, and I'm watching it happen, and it's unbelievable. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today. It's been 5 days since we've been together, and as I mentioned, I was a little bit shaky on Mondays because I feel a little bit intimidated by the responsibility of doing a program like this. I never quite get totally comfortable with it, and to be honest with you, I don't want to. I really believe that to be a little bit on edge and a little bit tight, as you were, is probably the best way to be. We would love to hear from you. I would love to hear your thoughts on some of the issues we've been dealing with. If you remember, we've been dealing pretty much with James Madison and the Federalist Papers for a couple of programs now. In our last time together on Wednesday, we completed Federalist number 39, and we just began number 40. I'll pick up with number 40 because and begin again, because I think after a 5-day layoff, it's not even possible to kind of remember where we were and just go on. So I'll try to do that. But I would love to hear your point of view or your ideas or concerns or contributions, if you will, to these issues. I think that in the particular Federalist Papers that we've, so far at least, chosen to look at, I really think that they are quite substantive. I want to spend some time today on number 40. I believe it's substantive for a lot of reasons, since the question that it addresses is whether, in fact, the Constitutional Convention had gone beyond what it was empowered to do by rejecting or eliminating the Articles altogether and replacing them with the Constitution of the United States. There's no question that one of the major criticisms at the time from anti-Federalists was that the national government created by the Constitution of the United States was way beyond the right, if you will, a convention called, the right of a convention called to amend or revise the Articles of Confederation. So therefore, looking at the charge of the convention and then looking at the way James Madison addresses this issue, I think is very, very important. For years in my history classes, when I beginning a conversation about the Constitution, and either a history class or a political science, a government class, it seems to me that you can usually get the attention of students if you begin with a hook statement, if you can begin with something that seems to get the attention of the particular people whose attention you're trying to win over. And for me, the hook statement with the Constitution of the United States for years has been that, technically speaking, legalistically, if this were in a court of law, the Constitution of the United States could be viewed as being illegal, unconstitutional, because it violated the terms for which commissioners from the states, 12 of the 13 states, were appointed. The call for the convention was specifically to revise the Articles of Confederation. And to go beyond that, scrap the Articles totally and replace them with something totally different, has always raised the question as to whether, in fact, the Constitution of the United States, technically at least, was legal, or whether, in fact, the convention had overstepped its bounds. That's the question that Madison addresses in Federalist number 40. So along with you, I'm very, very interested in how Madison deals with this question and how he addresses it. So that's going to be the focus of a good portion of our time together today. I would like to hear from you. We have a phone number that has been reserved just for the purpose of getting you and your ideas on the air, so that not only I, but other people tuned in to the virtual center will have an opportunity to hear your ideas and react to them. And of course, it's from a situation like that that true dialogue begins. And so therefore, we would love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on some of these issues. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to email me directly via email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, BRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And again, the phone number, 304-574-8178. Before we get back to the 18th century and back into the Federalist Papers a little bit, and I will begin today with a very quick reference, or I was going to say overview, but I don't even want to go that far. But I really believe that it's important, before we go into 40, Federalist number 40, to be aware of how 39 leads logically into 40. And, of course, as we know, the way that happens is that Madison made the point at the beginning of 39 that the two major issues being raised by critics of the Constitution were, first, whether in fact it violated the essence of Republican government, which everybody in the nation was committed to, and second, whether the convention had overstepped its legitimate bounds, its legal bounds, by theoretically ignoring instructions to revise the articles. Rather, the decision was made to totally scrap them and to replace them with a new constitution, which in effect created a national government over the states, over the people, as opposed to the Articles, which was a confederation of free, sovereign, and independent states. As Article 3 of the Articles of Confederation makes clear, the Articles of Confederation government is a league of friendship. It is a confederation made up of free, independent, sovereign states. And the states are very, very jealous of their sovereignty. There is no way, as they begin the process of fighting for their independence from the mother country, there is no way that they are going to design a government which has the potential of becoming just as strong and potentially despotic as they are arguing that the mother country has been to her colonies. So it stands to reason that the government that the Continental Congress created in the form of the Articles of Confederation would make very, very certain that the sovereignty of the states was not at all compromised. And indeed, the very second article of the Articles addresses that issue. The first article defines the creation of this league as the United States of America. And I think if you've ever thought, most of us don't, if you've ever thought about the name the United States of America, it's an expression that comes from the Articles of Confederation. And indeed, the Articles of Confederation did create United States, free, independent states. And the very second article, the very next item in the article, was to say specifically that all powers not expressly delegated to the new government, to Congress, in the document, are reserved to the states. The key word in Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation is the word expressly. All powers not expressly delegated. That means in black and white, written into the document. If you can't find the power being given to government, to Congress, in the document, then it remains a state right or a state power. This, of course, almost verbatim becomes the 10th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the 10th in the Bill of Rights. But as we have mentioned here on several occasions before, Congress, in its wisdom in designing the Bill of Rights before sending them out for ratification by the states, made the decision to take the word expressly out of the 10th Amendment. I think that's very, very relevant. We talked about it before. But the fact of the matter is that within the Articles of Confederation was a requirement that amendment of the Articles required the unanimous approval of all 13 states, all members. And of course, as we know, it is highly unlikely that 13 states are going to agree on anything. So the fact of the matter is, amending the Articles of Confederation was relatively unlikely, if not impossible. So consequently, when the convention was called in Philadelphia for the purpose of revising the Articles, the convention opened with the realization that there was no way that you were going to get all 13 states to agree on the particular revisions. In fact, one state, Rhode Island, was not even represented at the Constitutional Convention. So consequently, the decision was made to move that the Constitution would be considered ratified when approved by 9 of the 13 states. Obviously, that is in direct conflict with the Articles of Confederation. And that's where, in fact, the issue of legality and constitutionality arises. Anyway, those are the issues that Madison takes on in numbers 39 and 40. And we did 39 and finished it on Wednesday, in which Madison set out to make the case that the Constitution of the United States did not violate the tenets of republicanism, but in fact was quite consistent with them. And one of the things we focused on, you'll recall, is that Madison makes it a point to define Republican government in such a way that the Constitution was able to fit very neatly into it. According to Madison, a government is Republican if its power to govern is derived from the citizens at large, all the citizens, not just a portion of them, and if the people have the opportunity to participate in those decisions, which technically speaking would be the right to petition and the right to vote. According to Madison, then, if a government is based upon the power of the people, and if that government respects and incorporates the right to participate actively in its decisions, in those who sit in it, in other words, to vote, to elect, vote for representatives, then according to Madison, it conforms to the issue of Republican. And Madison makes the point within that definition that the input of the people can be either direct or indirect. And of course that opens a wide range of possibilities. And then, as you'll remember, Madison went through different portions of the Constitution and talked about those portions of the Constitution where the people had direct input and other areas of the Constitution where the people's input was indirect. For example, the Electoral College for choosing the President of the United States, or up until the amendment was passed in 1913, the states were the ones that selected members of the United States Senate. So Madison addresses the first issue of whether in fact the new Constitution is consistent with the ingredients or the tenets of republicanism. The second issue, which he deals with in number 40, is the question of whether the Constitutional Convention even had the authority to devise or to frame a new frame of government, a constitution at all, given its charge of revising the Articles of Confederation. That's the one that we'll spend a good portion of our time on today. Before we do that, however, I'd like to take a portion of this, our first hour of our time together today, and ask you to bear with me as we consider an article that appeared a few days ago. Actually, it was Sunday, so it was October 4th. It was written October 4th. It appeared in the New York Times yesterday, October 5th. It's an article by a regular columnist in the New York Times, Tom Friedman. And I know I've made reference to a number of Tom Friedman's op-ed pieces before. And I know that there are a lot of people out there that for one reason or another don't like Thomas Friedman. He's become so successful, and along with that success has come influence, which is so great that some people believe that in effect his status and position in society and in the world today compromises, to some degree at least, his credibility. He's seen as, rather than a columnist who comments on the political issues of the day, he's seen as somebody who, over the years, has been able to garner a little bit of self-interest in that very same political process he sets out to write about and to reflect upon. And so, in a sense, going back to the 18th century in their terms, Tom Friedman, to many people, has ceased to be disinterested. He has developed a particular interest of his own, and consequently, many people believe that in some ways compromises the positions he takes. It skews his positions, it skews his conclusions, and it literally helps to define the issues that he chooses to address as opposed to the issues that he chooses to not address. I'm aware of the criticism, some of the criticism of Tom Friedman. But the fact of the matter is, there's probably nobody writing today who has a grasp of world politics, especially politics in the Middle East, that even comes close to the depth and the range of understanding that Friedman has. He not only has background and understanding, over the years he has developed so many contacts within the region he writes about that he's able to give us insights that we really couldn't get anywhere else. I don't know for sure, but I can't believe for a moment that members of the State Department, and especially the Secretary of State, are not always aware of Tom Friedman's position and what he's saying on particular issues of international concern and international priority at any moment in time. In thinking about this, in thinking about the pros and cons of attitudes towards Tom Friedman, I think in some ways it's a little bit short-sighted to throw out the baby with the bathwater in this case. And what I mean by that is, because we have concerns about the credibility and the objectivity of Tom Friedman, therefore it's safe to ignore what he says and what he offers. I don't think that that's true. I think that it's much more accurate and much more consistent, it seems to me, with intellectual purity and dignity to make decisions about the quality of what this particular person is doing and saying based on what he says, not who he is. I think, and again, I'm kind of coming up with analogies a little bit, but we've done a little bit here at the Virtual Center, and I've been concerned for some time that an awful lot of the opposition that has formed against the Common Core standards in public education the opposition has developed in large part because of the reality that Bill Gates and Gates Foundation money has gone so deeply into the Common Core, into funding the development and especially funding their adoption. And a lot of people believe that if Gates and big money like that, philanthropy like that, is behind this, then it must be something that's going to benefit them more than it does me and more than it does the nation. And so consequently, there's a tendency to be inclined to oppose the Common Core, not because of what they offer or what they say or what they propose to do, but principally because of the people who support them. I think that's short-sighted. I know there's a very natural human tendency sometimes to go in that direction. But the fact of the matter is, I really think we have to be a little bit cautious and a little bit careful. With that rather lengthy and rather wordy introduction to Tom Friedman, he wrote a piece this weekend on the current crisis in the Middle East, which deals with the organization calling itself ISIL, or ISIS, the Islamic State, which some people refer to ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and President Obama's use of the term ISIL, which is the Islamic State of Syria and the Levant, Iraq and the Levant. So the Levant, which is the old term, pre-World War I term for this area of the Middle East. Anyway, Tom Friedman wrote a piece yesterday in the Times. And there are 3 or 4 things in it that I thought was so provocative and so worth thinking about and reflecting upon that I thought I would take it. I thought it was appropriate that we take some of our time today to look at this piece and to consider and reflect upon a few of the ideas and a few of the recommendations that Friedman has. Of course, he begins by talking about the threat, the current threat in the Middle East. And basically, he asked the question that all of us are dealing with: how do we deal with this? What do we do? And he says, what's the right strategy for dealing with a world increasingly divided between zones of order and disorder? How do we deal with a world that is so disrupted in so many different places? He says, for starters, you'd better understand the forces of disorder. If you're going to try to deal with disorder, you've got to make an effort to try to understand what's causing it and where it comes from if you're going to have any chance in the world of dealing with it. And he gives specific examples. He said you'd better understand the forces of disorder like Boko Haram or the Islamic State. Boko Haram is that small spin-off group from Al-Qaeda that probably even more than ISIS has publicly committed itself to attacks on the United States. And as you know, when President Obama gave the go-ahead approval for bombings to resume not only in Iraq but in Syria as well, a number of the bombing raids concentrated on this group called Boko Haram. And then Friedman proceeds to explain a little bit about who's in these groups in order to help us understand what it is that we face. He says these are gangs of young men who are telling us in every way possible that our rules no longer apply. Reason cannot touch them because rationalism never drove them. Their barbarism comes from a dark place where radical Islam gives a sense of community to humiliated, drifting young men who have never held a job or a girl's hand. That's a toxic mix. The only comment that I'd make on that particular paragraph, the opening paragraph here, is, first of all, I wouldn't totally accept the fact that even if you call it radical Islam, I'm a little bit skeptical as to how much this is really Islam at all. I think, to be honest with you, it's a little bit of a disservice to Islam to associate this kind of behavior and attitude to one of the major religions in the world. I guess my concern is if we intend to deal with it, if we intend to address the problem, we've got to be very careful not to do so in ways which offend those whose assistance and support we might need. I think there's no question that Friedman is right. And the reason, one of the reasons I wanted to mention this article is because I think we can learn an awful lot about our own upbringing, our own attitudes about right and wrong from reading this. Because what Friedman is saying, and I think appropriately, is that these people did not grow up in the West. They did not grow up in our culture. They did not go through our education system. They did not in any way expose themselves to Western cultural and intellectual development. And one of the issues that Friedman addresses specifically here is the issue of rationalism. They didn't go through something called the Enlightenment like the West did in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the tremendous faith in man's reason that gave rise to the John Locke's and the Thomas Hobbeses and the Montesquieu's and the Rousseaus and the philosophes, or the Enlightenment philosophers in Scotland, the David Humes and the Adam Smiths and the Adam Fergusons and all the rest of it. They didn't go through any of this. Consequently, the constraints on behavior and the contributions to the definition of right and wrong that rationalism gives to Western civilization is not something that these people can even relate to because they've never experienced it. Of course, the fact of the matter is all of the students who go through our education system experience it, but in fact they really don't recognize what they're experiencing. That's another issue. But it seems to me for those who know and those who understand what the Enlightenment was and the impact it had on Western civilization and on the way that in the West we define right and wrong and humanity and the emphasis on humanism and all the rest of it, this portion of the world is totally devoid of that. Consequently, or in addition to, I would say, that consideration is a fact that the people who are involved in this, Friedman is saying, are really drifting young men. They are people with no base. They are people that are not out to improve the future. They are people who come, as he said, from a dark place. Their priorities come from a place that many of us can't even relate to, and we probably have to appreciate that. These are people, as he says, who never held a job or never held a girl's hand. And what he's basically saying here, I think, is that all the things that we take for granted are alien to these folks. And then he cites an Israeli expert on Arab, what he calls it Arab social networks. And her name is Orit Perlov, P-E-R-L-O-V. Orit, O-R-I-T, first name. Orit Perlov. And she's an Israeli expert on Arab social networks, he says, and she's obviously a pretty good friend of Thomas Friedman because he said, she keeps telling me that since I can't visit the Islamic State, which is known as ISIS, and since I can't interview its leaders, the next best thing, she says, would be to see the Batman movie, The Dark Knight. In particular, she drew my attention to a particular dialogue in that movie between Bruce Wayne and Alfred Pennyworth. And you know Alfred is the servant, the house butler there in the Wayne mansion. And then Friedman proceeds to reproduce the dialogue from that movie. And there's two issues here that we have to consider going in, and I think this is important to recognize. Because her purpose in recommending this particular movie is to try to get some sense as to where these people that are involved in what we call ISIS come from. That's the first thing. The second thing that I think is pertinent here is how we deal with it. And it seems to me that Batman, The Dark Knight, raises serious questions about how we deal with an issue like this and how we ought not to deal with an issue like this. So I think it's a very, very informative dialogue. So if you'll permit me, let me share this with you, and then we can talk about it at the end. Bruce Wayne says, quote, I knew the mob wouldn't go down without a fight, but this is different. They crossed the line. Alfred says in response, you crossed the line first, sir. You squeezed them. You hammered them to the point of desperation. And in their desperation, they turned to a man they didn't fully understand. Bruce Wayne, criminals aren't complicated, Alfred. Just have to figure out what he's after. And then Alfred says, with respect, Master Wayne, perhaps this is a man that you don't fully understand either. A long time ago, Alfred says, I was in Burma. My friends and I were working for the local government there. They were trying to buy the loyalty of tribal leaders by bribing them with precious stones. But their caravans were being raided in a forest north of Rangoon by a bandit. So we went looking for the stones. But in 6 months, we never met anybody who traded with them. One day, I saw a child playing with a ruby the size of a tangerine. The bandit had been throwing the precious stones away. Bruce Wayne said, so why steal them? Alfred, well, because he thought it was good sport. Because some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn. There's more to this, but I want to stop there. I don't want to let that go. Do you think that Alfred is right? And that there are some people that can't be bought, they can't be reasoned with, they can't be negotiated with, they can't be bullied. In other words, they can't be reached in any of the ways that we traditionally seek to reach out to people we need to communicate with. Do you think that there are some people who just want to watch the world burn? It seems to me our answer to that question is critical in its informing our strategy of response. I would suggest that if we accept that as legitimate, if we agree that the nature of ISIS is such that it can't be bribed, it can't be bought, it can't be bullied, it can't be manipulated, it can't be communicated with, it can't be reasoned with. Rather, it's comprised of people who get their kicks out of watching the world burn. Once you accept that, it seems to me you also accept the consequences of that. Because what you have effectively done is eliminate all the options except one. And that is to make sure that their part of the world burns before ours does. I would suggest to you that in the context of decision making, that constitutes not the first decision that people ought to make, but the last one. And I guess one of the concerns I had here is to whether in fact the message here is a frightening one. Because it seems to me that if you conclude that there's no way short of an eye for an eye, then that in effect dictates your strategy. More than that, it seems to me to define the rules of engagement in such a way that they make up the rules, not us. In other words, what the conclusion comes down to here is that they choose the weapon. Whether it's going to be pistols or swords or something else. You are allowing your enemy to define the rules of engagement. Beyond that, you are abandoning all of the constraints and all of the issues associated with what you believe to be civilization and humanity. All the things that you believe these people threaten because they don't have it, you have decided to abandon them all in order to confront them on a level that they define. In a sense, they win. In a sense, that might be exactly the strategy that they are hoping for. I'm thinking of the beheadings, the videotape beheadings, and all of these things. Whether, in fact, this is an effort to provoke us into behaving like them and into abandoning all of the constraints, all of the rules, all of the sense of humanity and justice that the West believes its history has helped it contribute to the world. In effect, they will have been able to persuade us to go outside the rules of our own culture and our own upbringing and our own humanity. In effect, to ignore the limits of Western religion, to ignore the fact that all human beings are human beings. I'm not advocating a particular policy here. I'm not saying that this is wrong or this is right necessarily. I have my own feelings. But I don't think that I have the kind of right to stand here and preach at people and tell people what their feelings and their conclusions ought to be. But I feel here at the Virtual Center that I do have the right, I do have the responsibility to do the best I can to lay out the ingredients of the debate itself and to make sure that people understand what the issues are, what the compromises are, what the concessions might be, and what the outcome might be. In effect, one of the things that bothers me is we could lose by winning, if that makes sense. Anyway, I think in this particular dialogue from Batman, The Dark Knight, I think that message comes through. And I'm wondering and I can't know this, I really believe that Friedman doesn't buy that. But I'll just have to remain guessing there. Let me go on with the last part of this, the end of this dialogue, because I think it is really significant. You remember the last line we looked at was that they were looking for these stones. In other words, by calling them precious stones, for whom were they precious? Clearly not the bandits. They were precious to us. And then we found out, Alfred says, that the bandit had been throwing them away and kids were playing with rubies. So the question is, why would the bandit bother to steal things that have no value to him? And of course the answer is because they have value to us. And so this is a matter of provoking a response. And I think it's very, very important that we understand and keep this in mind. When Bruce Wayne asks Alfred, why steal them? Why would the bandits steal them if he didn't want them? And Alfred says, well, because he thought it was good sport. Because some aren't looking for anything logical like money. All of that's important to us. We assume it ought to be important to everybody else, but it's not. And it's very, very difficult for us to accept and understand that. I would suggest to you throughout the history of our nation, if you look at foreign policy, it's been driven by the belief that if there's a price tag on everything. And when the rest of the world refuses to be bought on a particular issue, it confounds us because we truly believe that everything has a price and that there's nothing in life that matters more than the particular dollar figure associated with a particular action or a particular item or a particular thing. And to be confronted with people for whom dollars mean nothing presents us with a conundrum or a conflict that we've had an awful lot of trouble in the past trying to figure out. And I think that this particular dialogue from Batman raises this question really well. I think that while Tom Friedman is presenting this in order to provide us, readers, with a way to understand ISIS, I think in a way he's giving us a dialogue which goes a long way toward helping us understand ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why I believe this particular article is worth our time here at the Virtual Center. I think it's important. And I think it says a lot. One of the things that it says to me is that almost every potential solution to a problem that we can come up with tends to be defined by what our culture accepts as a legitimate option. The one option that we can't go along with is the option that says that maybe they are right. Maybe they have something and they are fighting for something that we can't even touch, we don't understand. And if that is true, if that might be true, then that says more about us than it does about them. And I think that is significant in its potential. Anyway, Bruce Wayne concludes this discussion with Alfred by saying, Alfred, the bandit in the forest in Burma, did you ever catch him? Alfred said, yes. And Bruce Wayne asked, how? And Alfred said, we burned the forest down. Think about that. We got him. He's not going to steal from us anymore. But in the process of getting him, we burned the environment that sustained him. In history, this is referred to as a Pyrrhic victory. We may have won the battle, but the question is, did we lose the war? All I could think of when I read that last line was Vietnam and some of the people that I knew that were in Vietnam, and the Agent Orange and the napalm. Basically, we dealt with the enemy by destroying the nation, or the country, the land that sustained them. And the irony is, when you do that, you can't win. And we've had an awful lot of trouble processing that message, it seems to me. And then Friedman goes through, and this is the balance of the article, and I really think it provides, already I think that this article has justified the time that we've devoted to it here at the Virtual Center, because I think this dialogue raises some really insightful questions that I think all of us would be well put to reflect upon and think about. I guess I have to say that in reality, this raises questions and analysis or reflection to a level that not often does our educational system ever get to. I think if we're going to continue to lead the world and to be entitled to read the world, we've got to begin functioning at a level like this. Because while we don't like to acknowledge it, it appears that other peoples on this earth function at levels about things that we choose not to even think about. They are dead letters. These are issues that were already decided historically a long time ago. It's wonderful if everybody subscribes to them. But if you're dealing with a world where 2/3 of the people in it don't subscribe to the values you do, then it seems to me you have a potential problem, but more importantly, you have a potential strategy for dealing with and addressing that problem. However, it is a strategy that up until this point we have not chosen to accept. Friedman says, and this is Friedman, I'm going to read him very quickly because we're at 5 minutes before the top of the first hour, so if we have to go take a few minutes after our break, we'll do that. But I don't want to spend the whole time today on this particular article. But I really believe that it's significant. It raises some absolutely unbelievable questions. And again, I think it's an example by pulling this dialogue from Batman, the Dark Knight, we can begin to get a sense as to what literature, what the arts ought to be doing for our kids. If our kids were really engaging the sources, engaging literature, they would be exposed to these kinds of issues and these kinds of questions. But they never are, because they don't appear on the standardized tests. I'm sorry. Friedman says, we can't just burn down Syria and Iraq and Nigeria, but there is a strategy for dealing with the world of disorder that I summarize with this progression. And then he lays out a series of strategies or steps. He said, in those areas of the world where there is disorder, think Libya, Iraq, Syria, Mali, Chad, Somalia. Collaborate with every source of local, regional, and international order to contain the virus until the barbarism burns itself out. These groups can't govern, so ultimately locals will seek alternatives. So in a sense, Friedman is giving us a formula for dealing with the most disorderly parts of the world. Do everything you can do, local, regional, and international, to contain the virus until forces from within kill it. And they will, Friedman says, because these people like ISIS do not exist to govern. They only exist to criticize those who govern. I think that's particularly insightful comment. So that's what he projects about those areas of the world where there's disorder. Where there is order that is top down, authoritarian governments, autocratic governments. And then he says, think Egypt or Saudi Arabia. Try to make it more decent and inclusive. Try to find ways to make the order more human and more inclusive, but never do anything to jeopardize the order. I think we're realizing now with what we're dealing with, that when you sacrifice order, you leave yourself very vulnerable. In those areas of the world, Friedman says, where there is order plus decency, he says, think Jordan, Morocco, Kurdistan, the United Arab Emirates. Try to make it more consensual and effective, again, to make it more sustainable. In other words, do everything you can do to support those peoples of the world who are doing what you value. He says where there is order plus democracy, think Tunisia, do all you can to preserve and strengthen it with financial and security assistance so it can become a model for emulation by the states and the peoples around it. And finally, Friedman says, be humble. We don't have the wisdom, the resources, or the staying power to do anything more than contain these organisms until the natural antibodies from within emerge. We can't beat them. We need to rather find ways to contain the evil that they do until the forces from within their own cultures and their own societies rise up and defeat them. I guess the issue that I'm asking is that viable? Because Friedman says in the Arab world, it might take longer for those natural antibodies to coalesce. And that's worrying. And then he cites a historian at Stanford, not a historian, a political scientist, Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book in the 90s called The End of History, in which he tried to argue, that the fall of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Soviet Union, constituted the end of history, in that history was a struggle between these two forces and one of them had finally caved. And so what Fukuyama predicted with the end of the Soviet Union was nirvana in the world. That now our way of life was relatively unchallenged in the world. And now we had the unlimited opportunity to make good on all we stood for and all we could do for mankind. And of course, we know that Fukuyama's predictions about all the good things that were going to come to the world as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union did not pan out. Now Fukuyama has written a new book called Political Order and Political Decay. And Friedman says it's a historical study of how decent states emerge. What they all have in common is a strong and effective state bureaucracy that can deliver governance, the rule of law, and regular rotations in power. And then he begins to cite particular elements of Fukuyama's book and quote Fukuyama. And I want to go through this with you. But first, I do think we need to take a break. It's 1 minute after the top of the hour. It's 1 minute after 2 in the East. If you bear with us for a 5-minute break, we'll be right back. We'll finish this article and we'll get into Federalist number 40, I promise you. But I really believe that the learning potential in an article like this is too rich and too positive to pass up. And so that's kind of the reason that I wanted to take our time today to get into that article. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We'll take a short break. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. Please stay with us. We'll return. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour of the Virtual Center on this Monday. It is the 6th day of October, and we are in the midst of a fairly intense rain and windstorm here in the mountain. The sun was out. We came on the air 1 hour ago. It just shows you how quickly it's one of those areas where they always say, if you don't like the weather, wait a minute. And I assume that this will pass rather quickly. If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you have been with us through the first hour, we thank you for staying with us. For those that are just joining us, we are into a piece that Tom Friedman published in yesterday's New York Times on strategies for dealing with ISIS in the Middle East. And I think it's an article well worth a read. If you were not able to see it yesterday, it's still available on the archives within the New York Times. All you have to do is, if it's within 24 hours, all you got to do is click on that, and it'll bring up Friedman's piece. Or you can just go to the opinion section of the New York Times and go to the list of opinion writers, and under Friedman's name, you'll get a list of all of the articles that he's published from months back. And the title of this article, dated October 4th, is ISIS, Boko Haram and Batman. And I think, if you see the word Batman, you'll know that you're into the right article. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. And again, if you have opinions or ideas on this particular piece by Friedman, and there are a number of comments in the New York Times that you would, I think, do well to look at, because some of them are pretty profound. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. If you remember, just to touch base briefly and continue to finish this article as quickly as we can, Friedman sets out to suggest strategies, or to help to try to define the issues that we're dealing with in ISIS, because they are issues that we are not comfortable with or used to. And he cites a passage from the movie Batman, The Dark Knight, which is a dialogue between Bruce Wayne and his butler, if you will, Alfred. And Alfred, in this particular case, seems to me to be the source of wisdom in this conversation. And he's basically suggesting that when you're dealing with an issue that you don't understand, it could be a reflection on you as much as them. And then he makes the point that the way, in his case, the way they dealt with a criminal that they couldn't understand was to destroy everything around that particular enemy so that the enemy could no longer survive. And of course, the issue is whether, in fact, the solution is worse than the disease, so to speak. Whether, in fact, it is a Pyrrhic victory, where you win the battle and lose the war. And then Friedman launches into a series of strategies for dealing with different parts of the world based on the question of order versus disorder. And he's basically suggesting a few realities, truths, that many of us subscribe to. And of course, I think it's important to recognize that because we subscribe to them, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're true and that they will work. And even Friedman himself admits that in the Arab world, these internal uprisings against the forces of evil might take longer to coalesce. And that's a concern. And then he raises the issue of Francis Fukuyama's book called Political Order and Political Decay. And he's interested in Fukuyama's sense, or read, if you will, on some of these issues. Friedman says, because, this is actually Fukuyama, because our founding fathers were escaping from tyranny, Fukuyama says, they were focused on how power can be constrained. There's no question that what they are talking about is an abuse of power. In 1776, an abuse of power by the mother country. In 1787, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, an abuse of power by the states, who many of the founders, the framers of the Constitution, believed were too vulnerable, too susceptible, excuse me, to the people. Fukuyama says, before power can be constrained, it has to be produced. Government, Fukuyama says, is not just about constraints. It's about providing security, infrastructure, health, and the rule of law. And anyone who can deliver all of that, including China, wins the game, whether or not they are democratic. ISIS got so big, Fukuyama says, because of the failure of governance in Syria and Iraq to deliver the most basic services. ISIS is not strong. Everything around it was just so weak, riddled with corruption, riddled with sectarianism. I would like to spend a couple of moments asking you to reflect on this particular issue. That what makes the success of ISIS understandable, if you will, is that, according to Fukuyama, if government had effectively governed, there would have been no opportunity for ISIS or anything like ISIS to emerge. Obviously, ISIS was able to flourish in a vacuum because there was nothing around it that seemed worthwhile to support in order to combat it. If the situation was so bad, if government was so ineffective and so unstable, and it could not deliver the basic services that people need, then people will naturally drift to the alternative, even if they don't know or understand what that alternative is about. I think the message here is critical. Because what Fukuyama is talking about here, and what Tom Friedman is talking about in citing Fukuyama's book here, is that in reality, government's job is to govern. We have become so fixated on limiting government's power, on finding ways to keep government from becoming too powerful, too overbearing, too intrusive, too expensive, that what we have continued to look for are ways to constrain and control government power on the belief that people's freedom will be enhanced by doing that. What Fukuyama is saying is that government's job is to govern and to provide basic services. Government's job is to address the public interest. And if government is able to do that effectively, then there's no room for an ISIS or anything like that to ever emerge. It's the absence of basic services and the desperation of people that results from it that produces support for a rogue group like ISIS. To be very blunt, the main reason that I decided today to take a significant portion of our time together here at the Virtual Center in addressing this article is because I believe that this message is so telling for all of us in the face of what we are facing in this nation from a movement that seeks to disarm and dismantle government and to deny government the opportunity to serve people. To deny people the opportunity to serve people in need. To couch it or cover it up or put salt and pepper on it to make it look better. To do all of the things necessary to make their position palatable is the argument that people need to be free to help themselves. And government cannot provide the kind of services that people's responsibility is to provide for themselves. In other words, what I'm saying, let's be blunt here, is that those people in our, never mind our world, let's talk about our nation right now. Those people who are raising obscene amounts of money to run candidates against government's ability to govern threaten us with the kind of political vacuum, the kind of stasis, the kind of situation that in the Middle East produced ISIS. People must be able to depend on certain elements that can comprise a quality of life. They look to government to do it. They pay taxes to that government to do it. and to confront or to be confronted with an ideology that suggests that the optimum strategy in a civilized nation is to take what success you are able to achieve and pull it out of the community and keep it for yourself, is totally contradictory to everything we stand for as a nation, everything our founders tried to do as founders. And I think what Fukuyama is giving us, what Friedman is giving us here, in looking at the Middle East and the situations that produce ISIS, is in a way a mirror into which we can begin to see ourselves and the political situation we are in. It is so important that we be aware of this. It's really interesting that this would come from Francis Fukuyama, because Fukuyama traditionally has been considered to be on the right side of the political spectrum. To hear him in a book, in a best-selling book that's getting a lot of attention, talk about the very positive nature of government in its responsibility to its own people to govern, I find to be very, very healthy and very, very worthwhile for all of us to be aware of. To put this article, to put Friedman's piece to rest and to conclude, his last paragraph says, in talking back to ISIS, there's so much state failure in the Arab world, Fukuyama argues, because of the persistence there of kinship and tribal loyalties. Quote, meaning that you can only trust that narrow group of people in your tribe, unquote. You can't build a strong, impersonal, merit-based state when the only ties that bind it are shared kin, not shared values. It took China and Europe centuries to make that transition, but they did. If the Arab world can't overcome its tribalism and its sectarianism in the face of ISIS, then, quote from Fukuyama, then there's nothing that we can do, Fukuyama said, and theirs will be the future, a future of many dark nights. I think that there's so much in this article. I don't know how much of it Friedman even recognized. But I think the article is rich in what it offers, what it provides. I encourage all of you here at the Virtual Center to give it a read. And feel free to get back with us tomorrow, maybe, or the day after you give a chance to read it, and sound off on it. Look at some of the comments that are associated with it if you look up the article in the New York Times. See what some of the other people who took the time to make comments on the article have to say. Again, I think it is one of those pieces that forces us into the kind of self-reflection that I think can be very, very healthy and very, very necessary at times. We are at 23 minutes after the hour, so we've got a little bit better than 30 minutes, a little bit better than a half an hour to begin to take on James Madison in Federalist number 40. We began this last Wednesday, and I'm going to go back and review some of what we did last Wednesday with Federalist number 40 because it's been 5 days. But again, I think it's kind of ironic that here at the Virtual Center, after we look at a piece like Friedman's article and look at Fukuyama's comment about trying to constrain government power, that we move from that into the Federalist Papers, which is the effort of the framers of the Constitution of the United States to defend a government which they believed needed to be reformed because there were too many constraints on central government on the Articles of Confederation. And the result was that the same kind of disorder and instability and unpredictability that exists in the Middle East and led to ISIS, in Madison's world, the same kind of fear and disorder and lack of concern by government for people's welfare produced not ISIS, but Daniel Shays, and created the kind of environment where Madison and the other Federalists, other nationalists realized that if we don't find a way to create a government which can give us order and security and stability in this country, we will be doomed. As it's beginning to look in many ways like the Middle East is in danger of becoming in the face of ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and other groups that are groups built upon desperation, and especially the desperations of people. When people are desperate, there are very few limits to what they will do or the direction in which they will go in order to address and deal with that desperation. The public interest, the common good, government's ultimate objective is to govern in ways which make sure that those kinds of situations never arise. When you so constrain government that you make it impossible for government to govern, you face the possibility of consequences that we are seeing in the Middle East today. I think that's the message. I think it's one that all of us would do well to return to revisit frequently. With that, let's go back and look at James Madison in Federalist number 40 in his effort to try to make the case that the Constitutional Convention did not overstep its bounds, did not abuse its charge by rejecting or scuttling the Articles of Confederation and replacing it with the Constitution of the United States, because that's one of the major concerns and major arguments of the anti-Federalists. Madison said, and I think you'll remember this very clearly, Madison said that most of the conversation in the country about the commission of the convention, in other words, what the Constitutional Convention was charged to do, makes specific reference either to the Annapolis Convention of September 1786 or to the act of Congress calling for the convention in February of 1787, when Congress issued the call for the convening of a convention in May, which was the proposal that came out of Annapolis in September of 1786. Madison says that most of the conversation is based on the assumption that the only way to understand the legitimate charge of the Constitutional Convention was to go either to the Annapolis Convention and the call for a constitutional convention that came out of it, or to look at the Congress's call for the convening of such a convention in early 1787. So Madison, in Federalist number 40, begins with two substantial quotations from these two particular sources. The first one is the Annapolis Convention call for a convention the following May. This call from Annapolis, Madison says, recommends, and this is all a quote, recommends the appointment of commissioners to take into consideration the situation of the United States, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, and to report such an act for that purpose to the United States in Congress assembled, as when agreed to by them and afterwards confirmed by the legislature of every state, will effectually provide for the same. If you remember, Alexander Hamilton is the one who drafted that document calling for the convention. You'll remember as well that Hamilton got the idea, or got the substance of that document, of that statement, from the commissions of one of the states, specifically New Jersey. New Jersey's delegates to the Annapolis Convention were given the opportunity to do whatever they felt necessary in order to reform government in such a way that it was able to meet the exigencies of the Union. Hamilton took that and used it as the basis for the report of the Annapolis Convention calling for the Constitutional Convention the following May. Again, to look at it in a little bit more detail, the appointment of commissioners to take into consideration the situation of the United States and to devise further provisions which shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Being technical, and of course we spend an awful lot of time talking about the extent to which Antonin Scalia argues for the constitutionality of legislation based on the original intent, originalism, and the text of the documents themselves. If you look specifically at the text, at this language that Hamilton promotes in this call for the Constitutional Convention, it says that what this convention is charged to do is to take into consideration the situation that exists in the country and to devise such further provisions as shall to them seem necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. In other words, to make such changes or add such things to the articles that will effectively make the articles work or enable the articles to work. And then, whatever those provisions, additional provisions might be, to report them to Congress, and after it met the approval of Congress and was confirmed by the states, by every state, because remember, the Articles of Confederation requires unanimous agreement of all the states in order to amend them. So therefore, every state must go along with the recommended changes of the convention as confirmed or recommended by the Congress of the United States. Then they will be fulfilling the commission. That's the call from the Annapolis Convention. Congress follows up 5 months later, in February 1787, by issuing its call to the states to appoint delegates to attend the convention in May, the second Monday in May, for purposes. Well, we'll read this and we'll see what the purposes are. Congress says the following: whereas there is provision in the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union for making alterations therein. In other words, whereas the Articles of Confederation do contain provisions for amending the Articles. That's true. Given that, Congress says, by the assent of the Congress of the United States and of the legislatures of the several states, and whereas experience has evinced that there are defects in the present Confederation, whereas, consequently. That's the logic. Whereas there are provisions in the Articles to amend them, for amendment, and whereas everybody agrees that there are situations going on in the country which suggest that there are defects in the present Articles of Confederation, as a mean to remedy which several of the states, and particularly the state of New York, by express instructions to their delegates in Congress, have suggested a convention for the purposes expressed in the following resolution, and such convention appearing to be the most probable means of establishing in these states a firm national government. In other words, what Congress is doing is laying the groundwork for its resolution, which is the call. Because there is provision for amendment in the Articles, and because there's a clear recognition that there are defects in the Constitution, and because the delegates from several different states have recommended a convention be called for the purposes of addressing those defects, therefore, resolved that in the opinion of Congress, it is expedient that on the second Monday of May next, a convention of delegates who shall have been appointed by the several states be held at Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. For the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, and reporting to Congress and the several state legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress, and so confirmed by the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. Congress's call for the Constitutional Convention requests a convention for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Of course, the question is going to be whether scrapping them and coming up with a totally new form of government falls within the purview of this call, or does it go beyond? Were the people limited to working within the Articles themselves, or was it permissible to totally scrap the Articles and go in a totally different direction? That's the issue, it seems to me. Well, this is Madison's Federalist number 10. So after those two quotations, one from Annapolis and one from the congressional resolution, Madison then tells his readers in Federalist number 40, this then is what the gists of those two resolutions seems to be. In other words, Madison is telling the readers, based on those two citations, this is where we are. This is what the Constitutional Convention faced and had to deal with. Madison says, from these two acts, it appears, first, that the object of the convention was to establish in these states a firm national government. Let me ask you, was it? To meet the exigencies of the Union, to make such provisions and additions to the Articles of Confederation as to meet the exigencies of the Union. Is Madison on solid ground when he takes that and translates it into the object of the convention was to establish in these states a firm national government? I think you could probably go in both ways there and say that it seems that Madison is kind of putting words into those resolutions that aren't exactly written that way. Second, that this government was to be such as would be adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. Clearly that's true. Third, that these purposes were to be effected by alterations and provisions in the Articles of Confederation as it is expressed in the Act of Congress, or by such further provisions as should appear necessary as it stands in the Recommendatory Act from Annapolis. By citing both of those, Madison is choosing to give legal credibility to the Annapolis Convention call written by Alexander Hamilton. I think this is really important because it would seem that if Annapolis led to Congress's resolution, then Madison ought to be constrained to argue for the legitimacy of the convention based on Congress's call, not the Annapolis call, which fed into Congress's resolution. Does that make sense? It seems to me that what Madison is doing here is taking what he can use from what Congress gives in its resolution, and because it's not enough to justify what Congress does in the convention, which is draft a totally new constitution and scrap the articles, the only way he can justify that is go back to Annapolis and reinterpret Annapolis in a way which is different than Congress's interpretation. Because if Congress had interpreted Annapolis as Madison wanted, he could have based his whole case on Congress and not have found it necessary to go over the heads of Congress back to the original call that led to Congress's action in the first place. I know that this is nitpicking, and it's really technical, but I think it speaks to the fact that Madison is not engaged here in textual analysis without an agenda. Madison is not looking at these quotes as just texts and trying to figure out what they say and what they mean by what they say from the text themselves. Madison is about defending the Constitution of the United States to the point that the people, in this case of the state of New York, will endorse it and support it. So his agenda requires that he be able to manipulate language in such a way that what he feels he must do becomes legitimate. I think he's stretching the issue a bit here. His fourth point, or his fourth conclusion about these two quotations, one from Annapolis and one from Congress, is that the alterations and provisions were to be reported to Congress and to the states in order to be agreed to by the former and confirmed by the latter. And I think that's true because it's right in the congressional resolution. So the fact of the matter is there are four conclusions that Madison draws here. Three of them are drawn directly from what Congress does, the congressional resolution. But the fourth one requires that he go back to Annapolis because Congress's resolution didn't give him all he needed. Namely, that in addition to making the kinds of provisions and alterations in the articles that provided for the exigencies of the Union, it would, and he said, or by such further provisions. In other words, he would need more, as it should appear necessary, because he knows that Congress went way beyond alterations and provisions in the articles. The only way he can justify that is to go outside what Congress did and go all the way back to the Annapolis Convention, which led Congress to do what it did. Now Madison draws a conclusion based on those conclusions. He said, from a comparison and fair construction of these several modes of expression is to be deduced the authority under which the convention acted. They were to frame a national government adequate to the exigencies of government and of the Union, and to reduce the Articles of Confederation into such form as to accomplish these purposes. What Madison is doing here is reducing and reducing. He's doing the same thing he did in Federalist Numbers 10 and Federalist Numbers that he will do in Federalist Number 51. And that is to filter and refilter the same pieces of information, the same language. And every time he filters it, it comes out a little bit different than it went in. And by refiltering and refiltering and refiltering, he's able to draw the conclusion he wants to. It is brilliant. It is brilliant in analysis. It is brilliant writing. But let me be blunt about it. It is not the kind of language that the average citizen can ever understand. When people say that they have read the Federalist Papers, what do you think that means? I think we're reading the Federalist Papers here. But to what extent can you expect people to have the time, the inclination, or the skills to read these documents in ways which make it possible to really understand what Madison is saying? Those that support the Constitution of the United States, those that agree with him, know exactly what he's doing. He is using his rhetorical skills in ways to persuade the people. He is claiming to appeal to the common sense and rational abilities of the people. But the fact of the matter is he's arguing way over their heads. It seems to me that in order to come out of this document and successfully refute Madison, you would have to be able to make the analysis that we just made. You would be able to have to recognize that Madison is taking two quotes, one from the Annapolis Convention and one from Congress. The first one led to the second one. Consequently, you would think that Madison would base his case on the second one. And he does, as far as it goes. But since he needs more in order to justify what the convention did, he's got to go back to the first one in order to find what he believes gives Congress the legitimate right to do what it did. But then he takes those two quotes and he basically gives them the meaning that he wants them to have. And then he summarizes that meaning by reducing it even further into the fact. Look where he's taken us. He has taken delegates who are appointed to go to a convention in May in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And he's made an argument which turns that into the statement that they were to frame a national government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, of the government in the Union, and to reduce the Articles of Confederation into such form as to accomplish these purposes. What he has effectively done is interpret and reinterpret this language in such a way that he has given the Congress, the Constitutional Convention, the authority to frame a totally new government. 55 delegates show up at Annapolis in May. When the convention is convened, called to attention, called into session, there are 55 delegates there. Twelve of them leave almost immediately because they believe that the convention is going too far. They didn't have the right to do this. I wasn't sent here to do this. Because what the proposal is right at the outset is that the debates be held in secret and that we scrap the articles and frame a totally new form of charter of government, a new constitution. Many of the delegates become afraid because they don't really feel that they have the power to do this. And they leave. And the convention proceeds. I think that this is incredibly important stuff. And then Madison seeks to defend what he has done, to support what he has done, by engaging in the kind of rhetorical analysis that is brilliant and sophisticated, but I would suggest to you is very, very subtle. Madison says there are two rules of construction. He's talking about construction of language, rhetoric. There are two rules of construction dictated by plain reason, as well as founded on legal axioms. One is that every part of the expression ought, if possible, to be allowed some meaning and be made to conspire to some common end. what does he mean there? He's saying when you are interpreting a piece of a document, text, it's important to base your interpretation on all that's there, not just a part of it. You don't just go in and pull out the thing you want and ignore the rest of it. So Madison says one of the two major arguments or points of argument, rules of construction, is that every part of the expression ought to be used, ought to be given some meaning, and should be made to contribute or to conspire to some common end. If you are claiming the overall interpretation of a document, then all that goes into it, all that's in that document, must contribute for that conclusion in order for it to be legitimate. You can't just take something out of context and claim that that something out of context is an accurate reading of the entire document. He's right. But then the next issue that he raises, the second rule of construction, is that where the several parts cannot be made to coincide, the least important should give way to the most important. The means should be sacrificed to the end rather than the end to the means. He's playing rhetorical games here. What he is basically saying is that if you can't make the entire document consistent, he's admitting that he has had to pull some strings in order to reach the conclusion he's reached on the charge of the commission of the convention. He's acknowledging that what he just did on those two statements from the Annapolis Convention and from Congress was a bit of a stretch. Now he's justifying it by saying there are two rules of rhetoric, two rules of construction. One is that when you reach a conclusion, everything in the document needs to support that conclusion. Second, if it doesn't, then you need to distinguish between ends and means. And you got to make sure that the ends justify the means. And never allow the end. Let me get this straight. I'm getting confused here. The means should be sacrificed to the end rather than the end to the mean. You never allow the means to become the end. In other words, you got to look at what you're all about and you got to make a decision. Is this the most important thing or is it that? Because what you found is that there's not enough consistency in there to use it all to reach one conclusion. So now what he's going into is the rules of argument in order to say you need to use the whole text in order to reach a conclusion. But if you can't, then you need to go back and separate what supports your conclusion from what doesn't. And then you have to make a determination as to what the ends are and what the means are and which is most important. He is basically justifying the fact that what he has done, what the framers did at the Constitutional Convention to the Articles of Confederation, is borderline illegal. And now he's making the case as to why he feels he can do that. We'll have to continue this tomorrow. It is 58 minutes after the hour. We've got less than 2 minutes to go before our next program begins here on the Head On Radio Network. I want to thank you for tuning into the Virtual Center on this Monday. I encourage you, if you get an opportunity, go to the New York Times. Look at that article that Tom Friedman wrote in Sunday's New York Times opinion section I think it's one you can take to the bank. It's a rich article. I hope that I was able to do it a little bit of justice. We would love to have you back with us tomorrow. Remember, tomorrow's our late start. We'll begin in one half hour late on Tuesdays. So in the East, it'll be 1:30 p.m. tomorrow when we begin here at the Virtual Center. And we'll go back into Federalist number 40 with James Madison. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening to the program today and for participating. Please be safe because we want you back with us. Thank you.